Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you who are watching. Today, we are doing something really spectacular, and today's podcast is going to make you question a lot about identities and the kind of differentiation of lived identities that we currently exist and why it is immaterial. So, for that, we have Mark Gerban with us, and he is the author of the book The Jew Who Rode for Palestine, an Israeli-Palestinian search for identity. Now, this itself, the title itself is very, for the political pundits, it's like some kind of cognitive dissonance that how can someone be an Israeli-Palestinian or how can someone be a Jewish and a Muslim together? How can one be both? So that is something which is very essential that we have to tackle with because there are many identities like these that we need to understand. And before that, I would like to introduce about Sir. Mark is a former professional rower, so athlete, like bodybuilding and all of that, rowing. So he's a rower and a dynamic figure shaped by diverse cultural identities, born in Philadelphia to an American Jewish mother and an Israeli Arab Muslim father from Jisr az Zarqa, which is like around 40 kilometers down of Haifa in Israel.
Yeah,
Mark navigates his multifaceted heritage with a passion for promoting and understanding peace through sport. Now, most of you don't do sports at all, but this is very interesting to understand that peace can be initiated through the act of sports also. In fact, sports is very, very political. Championships achieving the highest placed finish 16th by a Palestinian athlete in any sport at that time. His journey to row for Palestine reflects his deeply personal exploration of identity and belonging. Also, when I read the book goes through a child's mind when Mark was a kid, how he had adopted Judaism from his mother. Father was Muslim. His own understanding of Quran or mosque or how he understood it, but also the timelines of things that happened in that process. For example, 9/11, the death of Yasser Arafat, the invasion of Iraq, so many other things. Even like in 2020, when the fishing areas were raided by Israel in Jisr, that was a personal moment. Today, 18th of March, or technically 17th of March, is also very important because the supposed ceasefire between Israel and Hamas has technically ended. This, I would be very privileged. First of all, thank you so much for your time. And I would like for our students to understand, I would be very privileged if you could read the preface of your book.
Sure. So just so happens I have a copy here now. So it's a short introduction. So I hope I don't lose anyone. But here it goes. So in the heart of Jerusalem, I stood with my father, anxiously waiting to enter the Temple Mount area. The ancient stone walls loomed over us as an Israeli soldier denied us entry. "You look Jewish," he declared adamantly, his voice carrying an Israeli accent as cold as the steel of the automatic rifle held in his hands. His finger pointed accusingly at my nose. With trembling hands, my father nervously shuffled through his worn handbag. He revealed our American passports, their familiar blue covers, attempting to rescue us in our time of need. As the soldier examined our shared last name, my father began to speak. He spoke about our home in the suburbs of Philadelphia, where we lived together growing up as a family. Then he explained our faith. In Islam, when the father is Muslim, his children are Muslim as well, inheriting not just the name, but the beliefs and the traditions. I was his son, a Muslim, just like him. However, the soldier remained unmoved, decision unyielding against the backdrop of the enduring compound walls. My father, a faithful Muslim, was granted passage during his visits from America to his homeland. Still, I was marked as a Jewish outsider and left in rejection and denied entry into the area. We exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between us. we would not challenge the soldier or risk the unpredictable wrath of the Israeli military. My father peacefully moved onward and left me behind. As my father disappeared into the backdrop, I was left alone, waiting for him with my thoughts. The city of peace, it seemed, had no room for me. This was not the first time I had been caught in the crossfire of identity. Being Jewish, Muslim, Israeli, Palestinian, American, and German. Each identity carried its own set of expectations and prejudices. Each one was a piece of a complex puzzle that, when pieced together, formed my very existence. Fitting in was difficult. Moments like these became all too common, but I learned resilience, perseverance, and the art of finding purpose in life through them. The challenges I faced pushed me further along a profound journey of self-discovery, helping me understand who I truly was. This path of growth and understanding led me to represent Palestine at the World Championships in rowing, where I became one of Palestine's highest place finishers in any World Championship sport. This decision was not made lightly. It was the culmination of a lifelong struggle, a journey to understand the intricacies of my existence, identity, and heritage. Each rowing stroke I took in the water was more than physical exertion. It bore the responsibility of solely representing Palestine. Every stroke was a pledge for peace, a commitment to coexistence, and the hope for a future where my identities could coexist harmoniously. This memoir follows my personal journey, sharing the challenges and self-discovery that reveal the complex dynamics of faith and coexistence. It delves into my experiences, embracing multiple facets of who I am. I wrote this book to bring attention to conflicts arising from these diverse aspects and to demonstrate the potential for peaceful coexistence among the people of Israel and Palestine. My hope is that readers will appreciate the importance of making connections in life, emphasizing the path to peace and understanding. This narrative speaks not only to Israelis, Palestinians, and skeptics of coexistence, but also to researchers and individuals from all backgrounds, including Americans. It appeals to anyone intrigued by the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It offers insight into the dynamics between different religious communities and serves as a call for empathy, a plea for reconciliation, and proof of coexistence, even amidst the darkest times. So,
thank you so much, sir. And one thing which really caught my attention was a disclaimer, in which you had intently mentioned that how the names and identities and places at several occasions had been left anonymized, or they have been changed to maintain the security of the individual. So my first question to you is that while writing this book, and you published it in 2024,
right,
was there any kind of political pressure over you, groups or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I've been growing up in political pressure for most of my life.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a scenario where I understand the risks that I take by going out and speaking about certain situations that are very sensitive, and also they put other people under very bad light. And you know, my attempt at bringing reconciliation or understanding is to not always expose certain individuals and say, you know, hey, you're wrong, or you've done something like this or that someone else just wouldn't appreciate. Because I think if you explain the story in a way that some parts are factually, well, all parts here are factual. There's no question on that, right? The individuals, though, it could ruin their reputations or that kind of thing. And my intention is not to ruin reputation. In fact, it's to let those individuals know that if they eventually do pick up my book one day, they'll read it, they'll see it, they'll recognize who they are, and they'll know that I could have outed them. No problem. I have actually tons of evidence to back up. I could even go through and just find the list of everyone, because there's a ton of information online. There's a ton of paper documentation. But my intention is through telling this is that when they see it through someone else's eyes and not their own, that they'll actually recognize the wrongs that they've done. And by that, they can then understand that you can only achieve peace if you look at things in a different way rather than the way that they did take things. So that's a bit of the intention and the pressure I don't want to put on other people.
Yeah. No, that is self-critique is a very, very rare trait, actually. And in political situations where the military-industrial complex has created a business model out of a conflict, self-critique is absent.
Exactly. And this is something where maybe as my life as an athlete has helped a lot, but you have to, if you want to get better at something, you have to be honest with yourself and recognize that you may not be the greatest person in the world. You can be one of them maybe one day.
Yeah.
But you have to work hard at it. And even those small little things, you have to reflect and say that this is where I am at this moment. This is where things are around me at this moment. And you have
I think there's some internet lagging.
to be honest with yourself. And that's something which I think a lot of people need to think about. And for some reason,
there was some internet lagging.
Yeah, it's let me I think I'm in a pretty good spot here. So it might be on the other side.
Or it can be mine. I don't know. Was there an internet lagging for everyone else?
So far, it seems to be back to normal.
Yeah, I'll edit it. It's no problem.
Okay.
Yeah. So after I don't want to give a lot of the narrative starting or ending from 7th of October, but for you at a personal level, it was loss on both sides. So how did you deal with it?
So the 7th of October is, from my perspective, not a starting point. It's just a symptom, right? Obviously, murder is murder and not acceptable. The murdering of children, especially the murder of other types of people. And the people that are responsible for those actions are eventually, they should be tried in court and they should be found under the jurisdiction of law as either innocent or guilty. And in that sense, if they did what they did, they're guilty, right? The issue is, though, is that people are forgetting the entire history of 75 years prior, and it goes back all the way back to 1896 and arguably back to 1799, if you really want to go further, from the modern Zionist movement, which I think you may be well rehearsed with Theodore Herzl. And this is the part that everyone just is being selective about. They have to understand that the situation in Gaza kind of erupted on October 7th, based on the fact that people had been generally caged into a large area. So Gaza is an open air prison. I've actually been around the area. You can see it with your own eyes. I've seen it through various visits. And it really took a toll for the worst in early 2000. There was already a lot of restriction of movement for general Palestinians in the event of having ID checks done randomly or being treated as second-class citizens. When the term apartheid is actually used, it is a modern-day apartheid. It's very similar to what you see for the comparisons of what you have in South Africa before Mandela eventually, came in and was able to kind of bring peace to that area. Given the situation in Gaza, people keep focusing on blame on Hamas, without also knowing the history of why Hamas had first come to power, and also why individuals within that government did what they have done. So Hamas obviously was a symptom of the problem, if you will. So in the 80s, basically, they were generally formed. There were 7-8 members. Arguably, they go back to already discussing in the 70s. During that time, they picked up, and they were actually even supported by the Israeli government to be a counteraction to the PLO. And so it's very interesting to see that there's a lot of this stateside manipulation that was taking place by the Israeli government to try and offset things by the PLO through the 90s and early 2000s. Now, the part for me that was quite interesting is that back in 2006, there was the election where Hamas was elected under the name of change and reform, because people were actually tired of corruption in Gaza. They were tired of the corruption with the PLO. And as a result, they were democratically elected. The steps that came afterwards were, and aside from the fact that there was a, let's say, a violent history, you could say, for how the Hamas movement evolved, it was no different to the Israeli movement from the 1930s. There was basically, taking a look in 1920, you had the formation of the Haganah, which was a militia that people in Palestine at the time, Zionist groups, came together to protect primarily Jews. And during that time, they became more extreme and spun off to different kind of organizations. So you had a group called the Irgun, and the Stern Gang, and a few others, which actually created modern day terrorism in Israel. They actually they bombed a hotel. They killed, there's a list of probably around 200 people that were murdered during the 30s and 40s. Those same individuals who were creating those bombings and attacking and all this stuff were the same people who were at the negotiation table to create the state of Israel. So the reason why Israel is reacting, the Israeli government is reacting the way it is because they recognize that if you don't stomp out something this hard, then they have a danger to their own existence, which is a bit of the problem. So there's a reaction to that, which I think people, if they understand the history, see that this is a dangerous movement. And this is why there's some very, let's say, almost irrational movement behind why the Israeli government is killing children, which is inexcusable, which is killing civilians, like it's a blanket attack on the entire population. That's genocide. That's not acceptable. And I think based on knowing that history, then saying, okay, that was the history, we then block the freedoms of everyone who's been living in Gaza under extreme constraint movement. People have died at the borders for health reasons, and many other scenarios have a lack of opportunity. There was more or less an explosion, which was caused by a resistance movement. That resistance movement, again, there's different ways that you could resist. People tried to do things peacefully for quite some time, and even during peaceful marches, with the Great March of Return that they were having earlier, there were people documented that were in wheelchairs getting shot and killed by the Israeli government. So the IDF has done this, and yet nothing came about this in the news. No one said anything, at least in the mainstream media. And then when October 7th occurred, people wonder, why did that happen? So I see that as a symptom. I see that as obviously it's a problem. I do not agree with violence. I think violence is anti-humanity in itself. It doesn't make any sense. It's made up. We created language. We created interaction with each other because we have the capability through language and communication to do things peacefully rather than be barbaric about things. And this is why, from my point of view, I don't agree with any type of violence. So the responses that occurred afterwards, if you have to go after anyone, go after people who are responsible for. And Israel has shown they've had the capability of targeted apprehension of people who have done things. We saw this take place in Lebanon afterwards with the explosion of those pagers and stuff like this. Yet, for some reason, you have an area that you control the entire border, you control the water, you control the electricity, you control everything, and you're telling the world that you can't do a focused attack to get just people who are responsible for criminal activity. I don't buy it. So that's where I am.
No, it's actually, don't you get scared by speaking this truth to power because of the kind of surveillance that is right now in the West?
No. And the reason is that, so I explain in my book, and this is kind of the reason why I wrote it. I went through a phase of being scared. I went through a phase of being repressed and then having people tell me this is how life needs to be. And after I finally recognized that I made mistakes in my story, right? I then reflect and realize, well, how does one kind of look back at how to learn from those mistakes and speak up about it? And that was really one of those things where I had this kind of awakening moment, which I did discuss with my family and my sisters and stuff. And after making the decision to represent Palestine at the World Championships of Rowing, I had an amazing amount of kickback from people. And I also had a lot of pushback as well from when I wrote some articles for my school newspaper, which kind of put me in a situation of understanding what it's like to be put under a lot of pressure and a very tough situation. And when I learned what that was like, I was completely alone, if you will, kind of managing this outside of my family, obviously. But I was alone, and I lost everything that I knew, and I had to create my whole life all over again in Germany. And that for me was the time where I basically pressed the restart button and restarted everything and had to rethink and reapproach how I considered life. And at that point, I just didn't really have much of a fear anymore in speaking out about something that's obvious. So if there's something that's obvious and you state it, have a discussion with people. And if you can have a discussion with people, you can be rational about things. But when you get to a point where you have a discussion with people and it becomes violent or irrational, then you recognize that there's just a point that people are not recognizing as true. And so from my viewpoint, I've had people who basically said, "Oh, you're rowing for Palestine." Like, my best friend, for example, turned his back on me from more or less one day to another. And I even ran into him at the World Championships in 2006. And I saw him, and we were both in the UK in Eton. And he looked at me and just turned his head away. And we're best friends at another continent in the world. And that for me was really hard. And I recognized if you're going to stand up for what you believe in, then be prepared that not everyone's going to agree with you, and that's fine. Also be prepared to be wrong. There's nothing wrong with the fact that you could say something that might not be true if it's proven that way. You have to be given a chance to you speak your point and you listen to what the other side says, and from that you can come up with a compromise where both sides can be a little bit more harmonious or together. Yeah. So.
Yeah, that's it is said that more than the words of our enemies, it's the silence of our friends that is often quite painful. And Yes, it takes a lot of sacrifice in terms of your inner circle because that has to be restructured and at times on a daily basis when
Yeah.
such situations happen. It's also an eye opener.
Mm-hmm.
It's good, actually. It's good in certain ways. And one thing which I also wanted the students and everyone who's watching to know about the love story. Actually, the book starts with a very, very enticing love story between Marx's father and mother. Mother was a very, very, beautiful swimmer. I think that's where his love for water comes from. And
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
was, and there's very beautiful, surreal scene of how they fell in love. And you should read the book. It's like romantic novel. So that is there. And the most interesting thing was that an Israeli and a Palestinian cannot get married in Israel, and they had to go to Cyprus to get married.
Correct, correct, and that's actually so. It's not just so the Israeli law is quite interesting. So it's not just specific to them, but it's also if you have any other religion that's cross-religious, they cannot get married in Israel, which is kind of like the antithesis of a democracy. So it becomes more of a if you have some sort of overlapping of religions, that to me is more of like a theocracy than an actual democracy in itself. Yeah.
Yeah, that is like, for example, in India, we have different legal provisions.
Right.
But one can get married. But there are other stories that I've heard also of not an Israeli or Palestinian, but an Indian or a Chinese trying to marry. That is also interesting. But going to Cyprus to get married instead of
Yeah.
Israeli, where they both were. And but my next question to you is that your sisters,
Mhm.
they imbibed Quran and Islam before you in terms
Yeah.
of learning and in terms of worship. And how has the family dynamics changed in the past when emotions are so vulnerable?
Well, the funny thing is that when I was around 8 or 9 years old, I actually learned first how to pray in a mosque, and so I actually learned at least the general aspects of prayer. And the beginning, I explained a bit of how I balance both religions to kind of do both. And at some point, I led my path led more to Judaism, and my sisters actually for quite some time were raised as Jews in the house. And it wasn't really until I headed off to college, just about, that my sisters would also visit my father's family in Jisr Zarqa, and they started to discover Islam for themselves. And at the time, it was something where I admittedly, and I explain this in my book, I was against my sisters. We were more or less the Middle East conflict in our own home, per se, but we were very much against each other for the fact that they were practicing Islam and I was Jewish, and I was looking at them going, why are my Jewish sisters practicing Islam? And every summer it would get more routine. They would actually go back to the village, and it wasn't until roughly August 30th, 2001, so 11 days, I guess, before, or 12 days before September 11th, that my sisters came back from the village wearing hijabs, headscarves. And that was probably one of the hardest moments that we had as a family, because it really tore us apart in completely different directions, because now they completely renounced that they were Jewish. They did a full conversion into to Islam, and I didn't accept it at the time. And when I reflect back on that now, I see that was pure ignorance on my behalf, pure. And at the time, my sisters started having a lot of problems, discriminatory, or even they had one or two death threats. That was the point that really caught my mind per se. Where when they had those death threats, I'm their big brother, and I didn't stand up for them. Like, it was pretty bad. And it wasn't until I finally had the more or less the right kind of environment or interaction that was within my fraternity at my university that I recognized that I had a very extreme view, much like you would see from a Zionist today that would justify the genocide in Gaza and in the rest of Palestine, really. And when I finally came to grips that, oh my goodness, what have I done? I realized that's where I needed to reconcile, and that's how I kind of bounced back.
Yeah, you do mention that it was actually guilt, which was reinforcing itself in different ways, which your young mind perhaps couldn't understand, because both your parents were very liberal, are very liberal. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. My parents are like some of the most loving people in the world. I mean, they're my parents, right? But they also they accept everyone for who they are, and they always taught tolerance. And the stuff I learned was stuff I picked up from Hebrew school, like that we are the chosen ones, and all this other stuff where you sit there and you go, I'm meant for greatness, and it's almost like this kind of different perspective that you're taught. And that was not something that my parents would simply say, that I'm better than other people. I kind of would learn this in a way. And that was kind of the scary thing. So I'd almost say that it's a form of Jewish supremacy that I just more or less kind of learned and picked up. And I went into that direction more so than obviously the rest of my family did. And I don't want to use the term guilt, because guilt for me means that, I guess I knowingly went in that direction without knowing it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I was I would say more brainwashed in a sense.
Yeah.
Right. And so when I recognized that, I realized I had to go back and correct what was done wrong. And that was first to kind of align things up with myself and understand that. And once I had that understanding, then I was not only able to reconcile with myself, but it was also making these other steps for some other life-changing experiences, which was also, coming out to Europe and rowing for Palestine. So.
Yeah. So it's basically the process of learning and relearning that happened with you.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, this is the problem, is that, in modern society today, you have people who are continually watching videos or watching the media or surrounded by a narrative, a story. And it's very often that we just accept that story because the excuse that we give it is it comes from a credible source. Regardless of the credible source, everything can always be questioned until you have 100% proof. And that's fine. You always have to be fair about certain perspectives. And I think with looking at that whole entire holistic view, that was something I learned pretty much from this experience is that you have to take a look at different perspectives, whether you agree with them or not.
Yeah.
That's probably the hardest thing for most people to accept.
Yeah, it is, because, this kind of like brainwashing that you mentioned, it also happens with everyone. For example, I ensure that my students know that there's a difference between the Israeli state and the Israeli people. Right. They are not the same. That is, there's also the history of anti-Semitism. There's also the corruption within the Palestinian Authority. There is also the autocracy of Hamas. Mm-hmm. It cannot be defended, actually, when the innocent Palestinians have been, at several times been victimized by Hamas itself. So that, and also the patriarchal mindset and so many other things. And I was able to understand the finesse of it only when I got a chance to visit West Bank.
Mhm.
And till I think 2023, for a very strong like I was I didn't know the difference between Israeli people and the state. Like
Mhm.
my brain was washed in that way. But
Right.
after October 23, I started reaching out to a lot of Israelis and Jews, and to unlearn a lot of things, because pain is pain,
Mhm.
human life is human life. There can be
Exactly.
no defense of uh, death. There can be no defense of hostages who are still, we don't know if what will happen to them.
Mhm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's no defense to the kind of trauma that the families are going through, and which the Israeli media, the Haaretz, for example, has been blacklisted by the government funding and ads and everything. There is this
Mhm.
media censorship, and looking at it from a different real political perspective instead of
Mhm.
like a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
So that happened with me too. So I understand. And I did feel at that point of time that I was so many years behind making such associations and friendships
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
of the brainwashing.
Yeah. It's a really good point, and it's an awakening moment when you recognize, for example, that a lot of things you're taught are wrong. So a lot of people, for example, still associate, if you're Jewish, you have to be Israeli,
Yeah,
and by the Israeli state, I'm automatically an Israeli. I actually um, had to go through a process in Germany when I got my German citizenship, as an example, to prove that I wasn't an Israeli, because I wasn't born in Israel. I was born in the U.S. And I came back and found out from the Israeli consulate that I, in fact, was Israeli, and because they made the assumption I was born in the U.S., so no problem. But they realized, oh, your father was born in Jerusalem, so therefore you and your next generation are automatically counted as Israeli, and I can't give it up unless I go to Israel, basically explain why didn't I conscript to the army, because I never knew anyway. Why are my kids and all that other stuff not registered, and all these other processes that I had no clue. I was born, and tons of people actually have this problem, but they can use that against you now. And that for me is kind of something where I go like, okay, well, that's clear for me that I had no identity with a political entity, even though I'm now part of it. So I can speak up, and I can say I'm Israeli. So people, when they actually literally say, well, you say you're American, you're not Israeli. Well, the Israelis actually call me Israeli because of this, and they go, well, what are you? Are you Jewish or are you Muslim? I explain, well, I'm sort of both. They go, well, is your mother Jewish? And I say yes. And they're like, well, that's all that counts. Your father
yeah,
doesn't count. You know.
yeah,
And I sit there and I'm like, that's a bit ignorant in that kind of explanation. Um, at the same time, it kind of gives me a perspective that this is not about religion. It is a political setup, which is a state. And then there's the religion, there's Judaism, which is why you have different movements for peace that are done by Jewish people who are not for the state of Israel's decisions. And there might be some that are completely not associated with Israel whatsoever, but Israel automatically will just say, well, you're part of us anyway, whether you like it or not. It's counted in the numbers for the statistics of the state. So there's a lot of pieces there which I think people are misaligned on with regards to what anti-Semitism actually is. And anti-Semitism for me is pure ignorance. That's people who don't like people based on their Jewish characteristics, but also anti-Semitism is derived naturally from Middle Eastern descent as well. So it's just been rebranded and reused. And I kind of look at that going like, well, that's racism or that's discrimination. That's obviously wrong. I think anyone gets that. when you criticize a government's behavior or the actual actions they're taking upon a people, or calling certain things specific buzzwords like genocide, like mass punishment, or all these other things, then that should be allowed, no problem. It's called freedom of speech. And it's also very specific to the fact that people, when they're stating this, are using facts to back it up.
Yeah.
They're using constructive facts. And when those get ignored, that's where things get very scary for our society. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what's happening in US and Columbia University, and it's scary for a lot of students, scary for a lot of activists. But at the same time, one thing which I don't understand, at one point, as not all of us are, it's not homogeneous, but at one point we are so sensitive to body politics.
Mm-hmm.
And then, this entire looking at the nose and then, in a racist way saying that, okay, this person is Jewish, or even using terms like, okay, you're a traitor or a self-hating Jew, or these are very hard-hitting statements that really disturb a person's mental state of mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, these words have been tailored over time. So there's been a very long, tedious process where the Israeli government has placed certain buzzwords over time in society to, I don't want to use the term weaponize words in a way, but they've more or less have kind of done this. If you take a look at Hollywood as an example, you have very often references to Judaism, which people also like. There's a lot of Jewish jokes and there's a lot of things, which I think, okay, that's great. That's fine when it comes to, little funny jokes here or there. And it's not having to do with this, with a government scenario. However, very often, if you notice, there's a lot of subtle kind of scenarios where they use these jokes to link to Israel. And for Americans or for other societies, they gradually think that that's part of their culture because, they can relate to a Jewish joke. They can relate to this. They can relate to Zionism because it's part of what's being fed to them. And that's been over generations so far. So we're talking, well, let me say decades, excuse me. So over decades, we've seen that, especially with Hollywood. And given that Hollywood has been kind of feeding that, like the media has definitely had some sort of subliminal effects, if you will, where more or less people are thinking that Judaism is the equivalent of Zionism, and Zionism is the equivalent of the Israeli state, and therefore you cannot say anything bad about that. People are now starting to understand, and people are trying to understand by taking a look at the facts on the ground and saying, wait, what I've been taught is wrong, but not everyone opens their eyes. And so it's been ingrained in their culture over dozens of years. And if it's ingrained in your culture over dozens of years, it's really hard to change. So I wanted to, and again, this is why when I wrote back my story, I wanted to explain to people that this is how you can kind of figure it out for yourself. Like this is how I went in this path. This is how I had to step out of this box. And this is how I can show you how to get to this a little bit more of an awakening, if you will. But it's got to be done in a way that people are not throwing facts at you. It has to be done in a human way to say, okay, like this is how this person would do it, and I can relate with that, and therefore maybe I can figure it out for myself.
Yeah. And so, because of your heritage, what are the common themes that you find in Judaism and Islam? For example, the idea of kosher and halal. It's the same thing. So there's so many, I'm coming from an ignorance. So what are the few cultural aspects that you find are similar, no matter what religion it is, like Islam?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So obviously the rituals of prayer are different from some respects. So when you pray 5 times a day, that takes dedication, I must say. And that's a bit more than what I see with Judaism, unless you're Orthodox Jew. And I used to actually work at a company where the CTO was ultra Orthodox, and he would wrap himself with the armband and pray in the airport, and that was just a different kind of experience, right? But that's very similar to what you'd see with someone who would be using a prayer mat to pray. So one is using a band and praying like this, and another one is using a mat. Then there's, aside from the ritual, there's a lot of different types of holidays, I think, that have some sort of relevance to each other. So Ramadan, where people are fasting, I think it's a bit of a difference. Yom Kippur, and a bunch of other scenarios where you have just different kind of plethora of aspects of the religion. So they have similarities in terms of both also reading from, well, this isn't religion, but it's more language, which is right to left for Hebrew and for Arabic. And they have similarities in the stories that they have for the Quran and as well for the Torah. So there's a lot of pieces there, and it intersects. And I'll tell you, I'm not religious anymore. So when I was growing up as a kid, I'd focus a lot on this. And now I'm a lot more cultural, just to be culturally aware. And I'd like to say that I'm not culturally ignorant from that part.
No, yeah. It may, I'm also not because I see that religion anyway is a very personal and sacred thing. Yeah. It's a process. And it should be personally confined between you and God, whichever God.
Right.
So, that is, but then there's so many political paradigms now. My last question to you, sir, is that why should your book be read? Explain to us as if we are 10-year-olds.
Can you repeat that again?
I wanted to say that my last question to you is that why should your book be read? Mm-hmm. Please explain to us as if we are 10-year-olds.
Okay. Got it. So I take this, the book is there if you want to learn about how not to be ignorant, how to gain perspective, and how to look for commonalities to build bridges to find peace with people. So I put it as simple as that. And I use my life story as a way to simplify it. I don't want to use the term dumbed down, but I think that I'm not really a complex human being. And I want to put it in a way that, usually if there's a way that I can understand a story, then the average person on the street, I would hope, can understand the story. And the idea is that if I can understand it, then someone else who's on the average person on the street can pick up the book, read it, and understand and find their own way rather than be told the way.
Yeah, because one thing is that anyone can make anything complicated, but it takes a genius to make it simple. And one thing which I've noticed in sports persons, basically, that apart from their very sharp mind, the sharpness of mind for athletes like you, it's of a different level. I cannot explain. It's a very experience-based learning. But also the way they simplify things in words that we don't need to intellectualize. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that is a gift.
Yeah. It's thank you. I mean, it's I do recognize that, and I see a lot of that trait, funny enough, to be oversimplified with athletes, because sometimes it's about how do you define emotion or a mechanism in such a way that it's fluid and easy, but at the same time strong. And that's a really hard thing to kind of train your body to do. And sometimes athletes just have that luck, and it is a different perspective.
Yeah, and it is way more hard hitting and way more, it has way more longevity in our minds because it was so simple to understand. And I would like to tell everyone that, you can buy the book on Amazon. And the best thing is this, that it is not going to take you months to read. It's not going to take you years or lifetimes. It is a conversation, actually. The best thing is it is a conversation. It's like you're going back in time and space and watching Mark grow up, and you're growing with him. And that is a very difficult and rare gift, because it also makes the author come naked in front of the audience. You don't know how the audience will respond. And second, there's a lot of vulnerability in it. And the second thing is that it's like a movie, it's like a conversation. It's not at all hard words, difficult words that you are lost. So you can read it. I read it entirely in one go. And it is irresistible, and it is going to stay in your mind, because the basic question that comes is, yes, a person can be Jewish and a Muslim.
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you so much, sir, for the privilege of your time.